The one slide I didn't get to share with you in the previous video on emotions was the slide about forgiveness. And I think it's important enough that I can include it in this one. And I think I was mentioning before to you that forgiveness is easy to say and really hard to do. And, you know, when somebody hurts us, when somebody takes us through some grueling pain for differing reasons in our past experiences with them, it is really hard to just put it all behind us and look forward and you know, quit holding grudges and not being able to forgive. And so forgiveness has been studied in various ways, and one of the things that has come out of the research is that when you are able to forgive a person that has hurt you, you are better able to improve your own health, your own relationships, your own emotional well being, your satisfaction in life. And so maybe it's important enough for you to consider doing it for that reason, because you have a lot to gain from forgiving others. Sometimes, you know, I think we don't let ourselves forgive others because we are thinking, well, they don't deserve it. But do you? My question would be, do you deserve it? And if you deserve it, which I'm sure you do, then you need to forgive, whether it's yourself or somebody else who hurt you. So, okay. And that's the last slide from chapter 4. So let's move on to chapter 5. This chapter is all about interpersonal communication. If you took speech already, if you took a speech class already, then this chapter should be very familiar to you. You will see some similarities from this chapter and what you probably covered in your speech class, right? They do cover it in differing ways, so just keep that in mind, right? Not every book or every class will cover the same communication process steps. So those do tend to vary. Okay, let's start off with the definition of communication. So your book is defining it as the process of conveying feelings, attitudes, facts, beliefs, and ideas between individuals, whether we do it verbally or non-verbally, in the such a way so that the message is received, right? The one that we intended, it's the one actually received. So the book goes in to tell you that, hey, there's a whole bunch of messages that can get through when two people talk. It could be what you meant to say. It could be what you actually said. It could be what the other person heard, which is different possibly than what you meant to say or what you actually said. Then there could be what the other person thought they heard, right? Then there could be what the other person says about what you said. And then there's you sitting back thinking about what the other person has said about what you said. So isn't it beautiful that we are such complicated beings, right? And as humans, we put a lot of thought into things sometimes, and other times not so much, right? But when it comes to communication, sometimes we're not even understanding that maybe the message we sent out is not what we really meant. And so there is a possibility for communication breakdown throughout this entire process. And speaking of process, the communication process, according to this book, right, involves a 7-step process. So this is where we're going to start off with an idea. You have a sender who is starting off with an idea that he or she wants to convey to a receiver. And the first thing you have to do with that idea is you have to formulate the code. What are you going to say? What words are you going to choose to express this idea? And so your code matters, because if your code is something that your receiver does not understand, then this obviously is going to lead to communication breakdown. So, sorry. So something to consider there is the language that you use, the words that you choose. The next step is transmission. So this is how you send it out. Do you send a text message? Do you put it out in the air using your voice? Is this through a phone call? Is this through an email? So there's that form of transmission. And then there's the receiving end. So does the person receive the message that you sent? If they do, are they able to decode it? So are they able to understand the words that you've chosen to use? Are they able to attach meaning to the words that you chose? And then step 6 is the understanding of that message. Hopefully they understood what you intended. And then step 7 is where they give you feedback, and then you can clarify if yes, they did understand it, or no, they did not. Noise is anything. It could be mental, it could be a physical noise, but it can occur at any stage. It could be mental noise that you have going on as far as the idea is concerned. Maybe you're like, oh my gosh, I just had an idea and now I can't remember what it was, and maybe it got filtered with a whole bunch of other noise that's going on in your head. So there can be different ways that noise can interfere with our communication process at any point in time. So when it comes to the different types of communication, maybe some of you have a job and your boss is a one-way communicator. He or she likes to send out messages, but does not give you an opportunity to give feedback, nor do they really watch you. Maybe they send out a whole bunch of directives through email, and it's one-way communication, meaning they didn't ask for your input, they didn't ask if you understood. And this is harmful for communication when it's one way, because it is assuming that the listener is going to understand everything, the receiver is going to understand everything that was said. So two-way communication is always going to be preferable to one-way communication. Two-way communication allows for that feedback, and that feedback is important for clarifying, for verifying if what was said and what was received on the receiving end is what was intended by the sender. There are many barriers to our interpersonal communication, and maybe in looking at this long list, you might be able to identify some of the ones that maybe you are most prone to. Maybe there are some things here that you are very prone to. Maybe you have been told in the past that you jump to conclusions, or maybe you have been told that you don't make eye contact and that you tend to disregard feedback. So kind of looking at this list, and I would go through this list if I was you, and I'd put a little check mark or something next to the ones that you think you might be guilty of, because you want to know, like, hey, do I know this? Do I do this? And if so, what can I do about it? Make yourself aware, have some mindfulness about it so that you can start addressing that issue, because it is a barrier to communication. It's listed here because of that, which means it's causing you some form of communication breakdown in some of your attempts to communicate. As far as nonverbal makes up a lot of our communication. Statistically, the numbers are between 65 and 70% of our communication is actually nonverbal. And so we express a lot of things through our tone of voice, through our eye contact, through our gestures, through our posture, through our, you can just imagine all the different ways that we express our actual feelings that come through. So the double bind exists. And what the double bind is that you, when you notice that somebody's nonverbals are contradicting their verbal message, you are much more likely to pay attention to their nonverbal message that they were conveying, and not so much their verbal. As far as deception, deception is interesting because when somebody is lying to you, it can be pretty difficult for them to hide that nonverbal aspect of their communication. And so, you might have somebody who is making eye contact with you, but under the table is fidgeting, or their foot is shaking, this nervous energy, etc. And so having that personal discomfort, it's hard to hide it because our brain displays a lot of what we are feeling through this physiology. So that's why we have lie detector tests that are polygraph based. They're looking at these physiological changes that we are not able to control. We're less likely able to control them when we're in a scenario where we're possibly lying. And then micro expressions are interesting because they're very, very fast fleeting expressions that sometimes we have to record someone for and then play it back slowly. And then we can see that when we asked you about how you feel about your sister, and you stopped for a moment and then you started talking about her, maybe if that was recorded, possibly there is a sign there of a frown, anger, fear, who knows. Sometimes that first initial facial expression gets hidden and masked with like a smile and, oh yeah, we get along just fine, when in reality maybe there's some resentment there from you to her, or etc. As far as nonverbals, we use all kinds of things to communicate nonverbally. We use our facial expressions. Eye contact tends to communicate a lot. That's why moms usually say, look at me. Did you do this? Look at me. And so eye contact is super keen in our culture in the United States. Now, this isn't the case across the planet. Universally, eye contact may mean a challenge in other cultures, or maybe disrespect. And so we have to keep in mind that in our culture, we assume that eye contact means that you are most likely telling the truth, as opposed to someone who cannot make the eye contact. We have various gestures that we use, body movements. You can picture some of the body movements that maybe you would expect me to be having right now as I am explaining this chapter to you. Maybe touching as you're talking to someone. You go out to coffee with your BFF and there is some touching, reaching, grabbing of a hand, pointing on the shoulder, etc. So we do that when we're talking, right? And then of course our personal space, and we have some guidelines there that are kind of unwritten, but they're written. And it's interesting how people have that intimate distance, and that intimate distance just for people who you absolutely allow in. And anytime somebody violates that for you, that was not allowed in, that is definitely threatening, right? Okay. And as well as the one in your personal distance, right? Between 18 inches to 4 feet. And personal distance, I mean, we kind of gauge it to the context, but that intimate distance, you tend to be disturbed if somebody violates that and they have not earned that right. So somebody who's in an elevator and suddenly starts speaking into your ear, that could be very, very disturbing and very creepy. We have a social distance and our public distance. When it comes to public speaking, usually you're farther away from the audience, whereas the amount of space that you and a BFF might have during coffee would be much more intimate. As far as nonverbals, our physical environment and our territory is also considered part of our nonverbal. So if you have somebody come and meet with you in your office, that could be sometimes intimidating, because your office may be displaying that it is your zone, right? Okay. And so sometimes, especially when there's a conflict brewing, it is highly recommended that you establish a neutral location. And that way nobody feels kind of bullied by the environment that they're sitting in. Clothing and personal appearance can also convey a lot, and can be a big part of your message. So usually people expect your clothing and your attire to align with who you are, what you're doing, what you're communicating. If you're a speaker, they expect you to be dressed as a speaker. And so, or a manager, to be wearing what am I thinking? A management tag or a vest, and kind of have that management stature about you. So yeah, so those are different ways that people communicate non-verbally. And then finally, silence. Can be very non-verbal. When somebody has nothing to say, you're sitting there left wondering, what are you thinking? And so it can definitely have an impact when somebody responds to you with silence. As far as our verbal communication, we use the word semantics to talk about the study of meaning and those meanings that words have. And, we have words that are sometimes very heavily laden with meaning and significance. They're very emotionally packed. So if you are someone who likes to use those emotion packed phrases, we have to be careful careful with those because those can trigger people, right? And they can cause other people to react defensively. So use caution when, proceed with caution when using words like fake news, and if you attach that, and then all of a sudden somebody might say, well, do you believe that it's fake news, or are you joking? Because that might be like their trigger for them. As far as your verbal communication, often you are also riddled with um, your self concept and how you carry yourself, your self esteem. And if that is identified as the single most important factor in your communication with others, are you able to make the eye contact? Are you able to initiate a conversation? And that comes back a lot of it to your self concept. As far as improving your verbal communication, these are some great tips, right? So using inflection, like asking questions, like sound like questions. I get some students nowadays that they speak monotonously and they just don't have any inflection and they just have almost no emotion in their communication. And it's strange, right? Because they almost sound robotic. So yeah, you hope people are using inflection. You hope they're speaking with enthusiasm. You hope they're not using antagonistic words that are, conflict initiators, right? Um, the tip about using short, simple sentences is super important because as listeners, we can only store so much in our short term memory. And so, one line sentences, that's about it. And once you exceed what the magic number was, magic number 7 plus or minus 2, as found in the research on the short term memory, you don't want to exceed that with really long, multi line, complicated, complex sentences, because you will cause communication breakdown with that, right? Also adjusting the volume of your voice to the situation. If you're in a very large room with a lot of people, you're going to have to speak up, whereas you don't need to be that loud inside an elevator, right? Okay, so using the right volume for that. Always offering feedback, stopping, pausing, asking, is everything okay? Like, did you understand? How are you with me? Did that make sense? Or are we not okay? And people will show you, if they're confused, they'll say, no, can you repeat that? And so it is good to always make sure you are checking for feedback. And finally, if you do tend to be a very fast speaker, it is sometimes considered a sign of nervousness, but most people like a fast pace of communication. They don't like it so fast when the words are like running together, but they like it fast enough to keep their attention. Whereas if you're a very, very slow speaker, that can cause communication breakdown too, because people just don't have the patience internally for it. So careful with being a really slow speaker. As far as technology and communication, technology has changed communication forever. We will never be the same thanks to smartphones and computers and the internet. And as of this survey, they were saying email was 80%, but I really feel email has dropped a lot compared to the use of text messaging, right? Okay, so I do believe that text messaging has taken number one spot, but I could be wrong, right? Okay, but that's my percent. I don't know how you all feel, but maybe you're like, okay, I check my email if I have to for work or for school or whatever. But if people want to get a hold of you, they usually do it through text message, right? So anyway, as far as communication between men and women, we have obvious differences when it comes to how we communicate, even in the subjects that we like to talk about and the things that we do when we're speaking. So men tend to use commands where women tend to use requests. Men tend to jump into solutions and start trying to persuade you and argue with you or control or impress you or negotiate. And women are more likely to be sharing a story, informing someone, maybe supporting, cheering somebody on, or seeking agreement. So keeping the fact that we tend to be different, if you are a man versus a woman, those are good to know, because this sets us up for some communication breakdown. And so recognizing, okay, when you're speaking to a man, and if you are a woman, recognizing they might want to talk sports, money, facts, business events, right? Okay, while they're playing a video game with you, and expecting for that to feel like intimacy. And so, women, you are saying, no, put the game down, right? Let's speak. Let's look into each other's eyes, face to face. So, yes, women and men are very different in the way that we communicate. And these are good things to look over when you are wanting to speak to someone of the opposite sex. As far as listening, I cannot tell you how underrated listening is, and how really important it's going to be to your success, for work, for relationships. So learning how to pay attention without just pretending, right? And just shaking your head, and without being a selective listener, which just is somebody who's just hearing what they want to hear in a conversation, but actually listening attentively and empathetically. So attentive listening, you're paying attention, you're focusing on what that person is saying, maybe even repeating it to yourself in a paraphrase, maybe even writing it down. So, attentive listening is much more preferred than just selective listening. And empathetic listening talks about wanting to and seeking to understand the person's position, because it's one thing to understand their words, but it's another to be like, oh yeah, and this is where they're coming from. I forgot she's a parent and she has a child in the school, and this is why she is so worried about blank. Right. Okay. So, yes, very important to consider that. As far as barriers to listening, there's a lot of barriers. We could probably have pages and pages of those too. But we have our internal filter, our internal noise, our prejudices, our past experiences, what we're hoping to get out of a meeting, what anxieties we're carrying around. So, I mean, there's so many barriers to listening, right? Okay. And then, of course, a hidden agenda, right? Okay, so you have a chip on your shoulder, and you're bitter and you're angry about something. It's going to make you a really bad listener, right? Okay, because you're just kind of sitting there. Maybe you're waiting for your chance to wedge your foot in there and kind of start talking about, well, let's talk about what you said last week to me, and so that can be a problem. And then, of course, just not interested, right? Letting your mind wander, and that can be a huge barrier to listening. As far as in the listening section, they talked about how we respond, and we have various styles of responding. If you're an evaluative or a judgy person, then the speaker communicates to you, and from there you make a judgment call. And you say, oh, well, first thing is you shouldn't have been there to begin with, right? And they start telling you, like, why were you that at the bar anyway? And so that can lead the person that you're speaking to, it can lead them into defensiveness. And so we don't want to use evaluative or judgy style of response. Another one that's kind of should be avoided should be the critic, right? So the person who criticizes everything and is not able to encourage people, but instead is critical of everything. So, yeah, not a good way. So far, none of these are good, right? Okay, the interpretative. The interpretative is somebody who is reflecting back to the person, almost like a mirror, and saying, oh, so what you are saying is blah 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 blah. So there really is even this kind of therapy. Then if you're going into psychology, sometimes you are taught how to be a reflective therapist, and they're going to teach you how to reflect onto the sender what they just sent your way. Being supportive, that's another style of response. And that supportive person will say constantly positive things to the speaker. So they're saying, no, 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 that wasn't you. I know it wasn't you. It has to do with the other people. It could not have been you. Um, and then the questioner is the one that kind of seeks further information, is prompting, is probing. And so this person, it's interesting to talk to a questioner because you feel like they're really listening to you. Right. Okay. So those are fun people to talk to. And then finally, the person who is seeking understanding. And the person who's speaking understanding is possibly clarifying, is possibly doing some of these other things, but you also see them shaking their head and reflecting in their conversation that they're actually understanding what you are saying. As far as criticizing, we already said that you should try to avoid it, but unfortunately, it's a very commonly used and very misunderstood response pattern. And by misunderstood, I mean it's one thing to give constructive criticism, it's another to just always be looking for those, break points where you can point things out and possibly rub it in other people's faces. And so, yeah, be careful with criticism, and try to focus on behavior. When you are giving criticism, try to focus it on what was done, the behavior that was done, and not on the persona, right? Okay, not the person. Don't blame the person, but talk about the behavior and what was done. Again, don't use you messages, and focus on what you actually saw, not what judgment calls were made or what somebody else told you was judgment that was made. And then never, never, never criticize if you're angry or upset in the moment. And, try to concentrate on sharing ideas instead of saying to someone, let me give you some advice. That give you some advice tends to also put people on the defensive. What do you all think? Right? Yeah, I think a lot of times people get on the defensive with that. So now on the receiving side of criticism, and you will receive destructive and constructive criticism throughout your life if you have not already. But some of the things that you should do, oops, oh, I lost it. There it is. You should listen. Try your best. Eliminate noise. Try to listen and see, is there some validity in what is being said to you, so that you can improve, because we improve through criticism, right? Okay, we need feedback so that we can grow and change. And so listening, definitely a starting point. Analyzing, where's this coming from? Asking questions when you're analyzing, making sure you're understanding the comment that was made. Right? Okay. And then deciding what to do in practice. We've already seen those before. Now, when it comes to active listening, there's a lot of things you could be doing when trying to be a better listener. But, as you try to see the idea that the person was sending, or try to understand the attitude they're conveying, or the problem from their point of view, it is important to kind of, make yourself aware of these things so that you can make an effort to be a better active listener. So it comes back to even your posture. Are you sitting like someone who is attentively listening, or are you sitting like someone who's on the verge of a nap? Right? Okay, so use door openers, and that means, hey, anytime that you see that there's like a little creek or a crevice, that you can kind of sneak in there and give an example of, all right, well, let's try, what you said here in the speech, this is what I understood, and then starting that and asking a question like, is this what you meant? And so those door openers can help to let the person sometimes restate what they said, and then you can really clarify what was said. Right? Okay. Try to keep the other person talking. That's important, right? Okay. And if you are trying to make conversation with someone and it just keeps landing on dead ends, it could be, we usually interpret that as, okay, well, that's not going well. It looks like they're not interested. So, it's good to have another person talking, and it's good to keep them talking. But I would say if you're trying to have a conversation with them, it's usually reciprocal. So you're going to take turns playing the speaker and the receiver. And that's what typical reciprocal communication looks like. If you were to ask Carl Rogers, who is one of our fathers of humanism, for the 3 most important qualities that are important for constructive communication, and somebody did ask him that, and here they are. So he says, well, how genuine are you? Are you someone who taking this to heart, or are you just kind of giving lip service and it looks like it's just cliche and it's on, play mode and that's it, right? Okay. Another thing is, how accepting and respectful are you of others, right? Are you able to accept their position? Are you able to respect their position? And so those are always important. And then finally, the empathy. Are you able to understand their position? How are they feeling? Why are they feeling that way? So that comes back to empathy. And guys, that is the end of chapter 5. It looks like we made it. So I will continue to work on the next chapter. Thanks, everyone. Hope you found it helpful.